In 1620, Horwich was a small settlement of 48 tenant pastures, part of the estate of Sir Thomas Barton. This had been passed down from the Norman barons of Manchester, who had presided over the royal hunting forest, which covered a large area of Horwich and Rivington for several hundred years after the Norman conquest. The main activity in those years was subsistence farming, with the wealthier farms being on the moors above Horwich, where handloom weaving supplemented the meagre family income. Cloth was washed and bleached in the local streams running off the moor, and although this activity was very small scale, it contained the elements that were to lead to the transformation of these tenant pastures into significant bleaching operations within the next 100 to 150 years. Thomas Hampson, in his History of Horwich, describes Horwich in the 1700s as a bleak and cheerless place, with only a few scattered insignificant buildings, making up a hamlet of just a few hundred people. However, thanks to its moorland setting, which generated numerous streams and rivulets, the area possessed the essential ingredient for what would initially create a local bleaching industry, and then provide the means of motive power: water, and lots of it. Bleaching at that time used the old atmospheric system, whereby cloth was washed in sour milk and urine, and then stretched out across the fields on tenterhooks to dry, and we have a number of accounts to suggest this was quite widespread in Horwich in the 17th and 18th century. For example, Bolton Fold and Gorton Fold. But this was essentially a cottage industry, with cloth taking weeks to dry out and be ready for market. Something much more organised and efficient was necessary to make it a substantial industry, and at the end of the 18th century it was vital that this process was transformed to keep pace with the increasingly mechanised means of textile production arriving in the mills of Bolton and beyond, massively increasing the demand for bleached cloth. The pivotal moment was the introduction of chemical bleaching using chlorine and other chemicals to rapidly speed up the bleaching process. And there was one family in Bolton who recognised the importance of this breakthrough and were determined to seize the opportunity: the Ridgways. And, in doing so, they transformed the fortunes of the humble hamlet of Horwich. Brothers John and Thomas Ridgway were originally bleachers at Dog Brow, Bolton, which is now the site of the Market Hall. But a fire at their premises in 1775 prompted them to look for a larger site, and they took out a 99-year lease on land at Wallsuches in Horwich in 1777. As we have heard, Horwich at that time was a drab little place of only 365 people, situated on the side of a bleak moorland. But the Ridgways must have recognised its potential for large-scale mechanised bleaching. And it is thanks to their foresight, power and influence that this tiny hamlet was turned into a thriving village community during the next 100 years. Incidentally, no one seems to know the precise origin of the name Wallsuches. It is certainly not a historic name for the area, and it is said to have been derived from the way the Ridgways issued their building instructions, namely, "We'll have another wall at such and such tomorrow." Not a very convincing explanation. Thomas Ridgway was the driving force behind the Horwich operation, and within 3 years had built a bleach works requiring 6 water wheels to drive the machinery. The business expanded rapidly, drawing in workers from the surrounding area, and with the coming of age of his two sons Joseph and Thomas, it became Thomas Ridgway and Sons, one of the largest and most advanced bleaching firms in the country. The company quickly adopted the latest chemical bleaching processes, and in 1798 were one of the first to introduce Boulton and Watt steam engines to replace water power. They also pioneered the use of glazing calendar to finish cloth, and must have been a major producer of gingham cloth, since they named their main 5-story structure Gingham House. For the time, the Ridgways also seem to have adopted a relatively benevolent attitude towards their workforce, with good rates of pay and conditions. Disloyalty or dishonesty were, however, heavily punished, as was the order of the day, and there is a record of one of their workers, John Boothman, being transported to Australia for stealing £20 in 1802. Others weren't so lucky. James Holland was one of a number of men executed in the Bolton area for stealing 30 yards of cloth. The rapidly growing community needed guidance on how to properly establish itself and its facilities. This is where the Ridgways were at their most paternalistic and influential, some might say dictatorial, particularly Joseph Ridgway. Looking down on the village from their home at Ridgemont, the family assisted with the building of the parish church school in 1793 and the rebuilding of the parish church in 1830, and set up a building club in 1802 to enable employees to construct their own homes. This attractive area of stone terraces directly opposite the parish church is still known today as the clubhouses. They also presided over numerous local bodies, using the Black Bull as their meeting place, with Joseph Ridgway becoming chairman of the local magistrates' bench for many years, and they were instrumental in bringing the penny post to Horwich in 1815. Wallsuches was the equivalent of a village in itself, with its separate, well-ventilated buildings and cobblestone roads, surrounded by large reservoirs with numerous quarries and mines on the moorland behind. With its truck shop providing all the necessary goods for the workforce, it was, in fact, a village within a village, which in turn provided houses, schools, and a church, all just around the corner. And that old village community is still very much in evidence today in what we call the top side of Horwich. For over 200 years, the Wallsuches clock and bell have stood as proud symbols of the legacy of bleaching on the site, and it is fitting that they should form part of the new residential scheme now known as Arkon Village. Wallsuches was in fact the heart of Horwich throughout the 19th century, for without it and the Ridgways, the town would not have developed in the way that it did. At its height, the bleach works was a very busy place, employing hundreds of people, and its employees would regularly work until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, after which they would lie down on a bale of cloth to snatch a few hours' sleep before beginning work again at 6 o'clock. This could mean that for long periods male employees only saw their womenfolk when they brought food to the works. Despite the long hours and dangerous conditions, jobs were secure and work plentiful, and there is plenty of evidence of 3 or 4 generations of a family working there. It was a way of life, with a fair day's work for a fair day's pay. The Ridgways were good employers for their time, despite employing child labour in the early years, who overall treated their workforce well and were concerned for their welfare. They even continued to pay their workers when there was little work during the cotton famine in the 1860s, brought about by the American Civil War. Payday at Wallsuches was an extremely important occasion, both for the employee, his family, and the community. By 1830, such days, as they were known, were regularized once a month, at which time the whole community came out to play, dressing up, holding events, meetings, and generally celebrating. Once payment became more frequent towards the middle of the 19th century, this practice began to die out. The contribution of the Ridgways to Horwich cannot be underestimated. They gave a great deal to the community in terms of building a secure employment base where none had existed before, organising and funding religious and social life, and laying the foundations for Horwich as we know it today. Joseph Ridgway was in his own way a model paternalist, creating an ordered and secure social world of steady employment, decent housing, and good schools. Thanksgiving services, annual picnics and fetes, alongside regular work, made Horwich the envy of many other communities nearby, and the villagers looked up to Joseph Ridgway as the father of the parish. However, his reputation was tarnished by a few uncharitable acts, the most notable relating to his disagreement with Reverend Hewitt. Unfortunately, his generosity in contributing a sizable amount of money to the building of the new Holy Trinity Parish Church was overshadowed by a bitter feud with the vicar, which could well have been about who was the most powerful man in the village. This resulted in Joseph Ridgway erecting a mound between his house in Ridgemont and the vicarage on Fleet Street, with a statue of his favourite racehorse General Jeffrey on top of it, ostensibly to commemorate the horse's death. This hill of spite still remains in the corner of Ridgemont Park, and is now more respectfully known as Daffodil Hill. This rift was never healed, and when Joseph Ridgway died in 1842, all the bequests in his will benefiting the parish church were suspended until Reverend Hewitt left the parish, which he eventually did 10 years later. Joseph Ridgway was buried in the family vault in the parish church, of which he was such an important benefactor. Given the nature of the man, it is perhaps not surprising that the beautiful white marble statue in there, which he commissioned before his death, shows his wife kneeling at prayer in front of him. He was obviously someone of great importance to the development of Horwich, and it is clear that as a result he expected to be respected and given due deference. In lavishing so much time and money on the parish church, he was also perhaps trying to secure his place in heaven as well as on earth. Despite the death of Joseph Ridgway in 1842, the business continued to prosper. Since he had no heir, the family line was continued through his brother Thomas, who died in 1879. The Ridgways also entered into two partnerships, firstly with their nephew Thomas Bridson between 1813 and 1834, and later with two long-standing employees, Charles and Christopher Howarth, who eventually became sole owners of the business. The firm continued until 1900, when it was sold to the Bleachers Association. When the bleach works closed in 1933, it marked the end of an era for Horwich, a 150-year association which had seen a total transformation from a remote hamlet chosen by the Ridgways as the site for their new bleach works to a dynamic industrial town, now dominated by the giant locomotive works. Horwichers will always be indebted to the Ridgways for coming to the area, and doing so much to establish the attractive town we now know today. And fortunately, many features of the Ridgway era remain. The parish church, 2 parish schools, the clubhouses and Ridgemont are living monuments to their philanthropy, and despite falling into disrepair during the post-war years as part of Archon engineering, Wallsuches Bleach Works has now been given a new lease of life as Archon Village, thanks to a sensitive and enterprising redevelopment scheme by Redrow Homes, a fitting tribute to the town's great benefactors. The clubhouses. As we have heard right from the early years of their operation, the Ridgways were anxious to provide accommodation for their new workforce, the majority of whom were coming from nearby areas like Dean, West Horton, Blackrod, Adlington and Chorley. They were also keen that these employees should own their own homes, and to this end set up a building scheme providing land and cheap finance to enable this to happen. Workers joined the building club in order to qualify for one of the new houses, and this is the origin of the term clubhouses, which has remained to this day. The scheme started in 1801, and we have on record the names of Ashton, Eatock, Petty, Pennington, Plumpton, Ridmain, Schofield, Thornley and Willesden as being amongst the earliest occupants. Multiple ownership also suggests there was an element of property speculation going on from the beginning, but needless to say, most people would only have been able to afford to rent rather than to buy. Because the houses weren't numbered until the 1870s, it's difficult to work out who lived where from the parish records and the 1841, 51 and 61 censuses, but we have some clues on the old plans. It is also difficult to work out the precise order in which the houses were built. It would appear that the first ones were built opposite the parish church, including the Brown Cow pub, followed by the individual streets running at right angles to what is now Church Street, starting with Nelson Street and gradually working their way down to Owens Row. A second clubhouses scheme was started in 1829, and as the area developed, a shop and another pub, the Horseshoe, opened on Church Street frontage, as well as the Sawyer's Arms on Nelson Street. There was also a Methodist chapel at the end of Chapel Street, which will be remembered more recently as the Nanon Chapel. Thanks to the power and influence of the Ridgways and their rapidly developing bleach works, a postal service arrived in Horwich in the early 1800s, and the first post office in Horwich opened in Church Street in 1807. As we look around the area today, we see an interesting contrast in building styles, with many features reminiscent of the days of the horse and cart. Unfortunately, few original features remain within the houses, and most of the sash windows have been replaced by modern ones, despite the area being a conservation area, but the charm is still there. Not surprisingly, the early records tell us that the majority of residents had occupations directly related to the bleaching industry: spinner, weaver, crofter, finisher. But there were also the supporting skills like joiners, stonemasons, plumbers, saddlers, blacksmiths, sawyers, millwrights, and general labourers. There was even a butcher who presumably visited the local farms to carry out his services. Despite the rapid development of the bleach works, the putting out system was still in operation in the late 17th to early 1800s, whereby cloth was spun and woven at home, and then collected by the bleachers. There is clear evidence of this in the number of cellars still visible where the weavers would have worked. The club houses also had their own allotments situated behind George Street. These lasted until after World War II. Many Horwich families can trace their ancestry back to the clubhouses and bleachworks. Here are some of the stories we have uncovered.
This house was built for my great-great-grandfather, Christopher Petty, who came to Horwich from Yorkshire, and after he married in 1805, he came here with his wife and then later his family, and you can see by the date stone up there that he had put into the building. It's got his P at the top for the surname, and then the C is for Christopher, A for Alice, which was his wife, and then the 1807, of course. Now, I don't know a great lot about Christopher, except that he came from Yorkshire, and he was the son of a yeoman farmer, and they had the farm near Kirkby Malham, which is now a well-known tourist attraction. When he was 21, he inherited £250 from his father, who had died a few years earlier as a yeoman farmer, but he left the farm to his eldest son Francis, and that's where the Francis keeps connecting with the family. Then he was the next eldest, and he had a younger sister and brother, and they each inherited £250, and that was a lot of money in 1799 when Christopher would be 21. Now, why you would choose to come from the middle of Yorkshire to a little village here in about 1800, we just cannot imagine. There doesn't seem to be any reason or connection, but there he is. He came and he stayed here. So he had 10 children altogether. 3 of them died very young, 2 as babies and 1 was only 3 years old. But the others all prospered in the town as butchers and farmers, and Christopher was a butcher, so we don't know where he had his shop, but it may have been down near the Lee Lane, somewhere down there. But we've never been able to establish exactly where he was. What can I say about the house itself? I say he sold it in 1813, but we don't know where he went. His wife was Alice Roscoe, and I haven't been able to find out anything about her at all. I mean, there were 2 or 3 Roscoes in the area, but whether she was one of them, I don't know. This used to be the Horwich Old Boys School, and I first came here in 1940 after we'd moved back to Horwich from Charnock Richard, where we'd lived for a few years. And it was February, I remember, and I started in the bottom class, which was the annex, as we called it, over there. And the teacher was Mrs. Inglis. So I was only in there for a few months before the summer holidays, and then I moved up into Mrs. Allen's class, which was through the front door to the left, far end of the hall, and that was where she had taught for many, many years. In fact, she taught my father in 1905, so she'd been there a long time. My first recollections of this school are that it was 1940, so war had just broken out. There was air raid shelters either side of the gate, and I only remember only once we were taken in as a sort of exercise. In the school itself, I can remember the banister going up to the upper to the top room, which was the headmaster's, and you could slide down the banister by getting your sleeve onto the banister, and then it was a wooden partition, and you could then slide down at great speed. And on one occasion I had the misfortune to come down, and as I reached the bottom, Mrs. Inglis was just coming around the corner, and I collided with her, and she wasn't amused at all, so she walloped me across my ear. Anyway, that's by the way. So my recollections of Mrs. Allen mainly are that she obviously was very patriotic, and she used to gather us into the hall where the piano was, and we all stood round it, and she taught us all the patriotic songs like Land of Hope and Glory, Lords of the Air, and Rule Britannia, and several others, and she really drilled those into us, so I still remember them to this day. But she maintained good discipline. She had a cane which she always kept on her desk, and also when we were in the hall, she would have it on top of the piano, so there was no getting away. If anybody started acting the fool, you knew what to expect. But she was very good, really. And I said, then I went up into Mr. Jones's class, and he was the headmaster at the top there. Now, my only other connection with the church school and the church is that in the graveyard, my parents and my grandparents, my aunt and an uncle, and my great grandmother are all buried in there. So there is a sort of permanent connection with the parish church. But I had no connection with the church itself because I was a Methodist and went to Bottomouth Moor. So that was how things were. A couple of things I remember about 1940 was that on one occasion we were all marched down to the corner of Victoria Road because apparently the King and Queen had arrived at the railway station and were coming to go to the loco works, so we all had to stand on the corner of Victoria Road there and cheer when this Rolls Royce went past. The only thing I always remember about that, after we got back here, we always had to write an essay, and I always remember odd things. It was the first time I'd heard the word khaki, because Mrs. Inglis was giving us some hints about writing the essay, and she said, you can say that the king wore a khaki uniform, and that was the first time I'd heard the word khaki, and I've remembered it ever since. On another occasion we were marched down to the Palace Cinema, which is now the Livesey's Undertaker's place, and we saw a film which was about Queen Victoria, if I remember, but I was only 8 years old, and it was all above my head. I didn't really understand what it was all about. All I can remember is when we went, I'd never been in a cinema, I didn't know what they were. I thought the screen was going to move back like curtains do, and I was surprised when pictures appeared on the screen itself. But that's another thing. And the other thing I remember, it must have been perhaps 1941 or 42, just before lunchtime, we heard this droning of an aeroplane coming over very low, and we could tell he was in trouble. And he went over, and we knew that he was going to land or crash or something. So when we came out at lunchtime, a lot of us ran up Sinkers Field, and there was the pilot stood outside this. It was only a small plane, I can't remember really what sort it was, but he was stood there quite unconcerned, and he was just waiting, and I suppose he'd radioed and said he was in trouble. And when we came back, so we went home for our lunch, came back and had another look, but by the time we got there the second time, the police were there keeping guard on it to stop us taking bits and pieces off it for souvenirs. So that was the time when I said the aeroplane came over. My recollections of Nelson Street are that in the 1940s my aunt, Mrs. Cooper, lived near the bottom at number 14, so I visited many times, especially from school, would go down there. And the other recollection I had was when this was the Sawyer's Arms. The only time I ever went was during my national service in about 1955. I came home on one weekend and found my pals, I was told, had gone down into the Sawyers. Why they came to the Sawyers, I don't know. But I came down here in uniform, went in, we had a couple of drinks, and then back home again. So that was my last recollection. But I've just been told that the landlord and lady here were the Farnworths, and Kathleen Farnworth, who married Chris Pyle, bought my father's house on Bottomouth Moor, where I was born next door at 37, but 36. They bought number 36 off my father in 1974, and Kathleen has lived there ever since. So it's strange that should be that connection, that her father was the landlord here, and then she ended up buying the house where I grew up. This row of shops has changed entirely from what I remember. I think there used to be a newsagent's here, and then on the corner was a cake shop, and I can't just remember the name, and then next to it was Horrocks's clogger's shop. And in those days, coming to school, I wore clogs, and a lot of other people did. So we used to go into there to have new irons put on, because we had irons on, which was all the way then of clogging clogs, as we called it. So that's my. And farther up on the next row, about halfway along, one of my distant relatives, Mrs. Tong, she had a little shop that sold all sorts of odds and ends, and she was a distant relative of mine, because I'm descended from the Tongs on one side, so she was well known to my family. And then just there next to this was the Brown Cow public house, but next door to it was the fish and chip shop. And when we were in our teens and we were walking up from the pictures, we used to go on a Saturday night, we'd walk up to save bus fare, we would call in and get fish and chips, and then walk up through the cemetery eating our fish and chips. That was our recollection of it.
There are a number of familiar Horwich names who appear in the early records of the clubhouses, like Farrington, Hopwood, Longworth, Pass and Whittle, but none are more prominent than that of Andrew Peake. In 1841 he was living there with his mother Alice, widow of William, and as a young man he went, like so many others, to work at Wallsuches bleach works, where he rose to become department manager. He obviously had entrepreneurial spirit, because shortly afterwards he became a brick manufacturer at Wilderswood and built a number of properties in Horwich. He went on to become a prominent businessman and major employer, and served on the local board, and it was he who donated the lamp and drinking fountain which stood for many years outside the Crown Hotel. As a committed Christian, he was a major benefactor of Lee Lane Congregational Church, donating the church clock, choir gallery, and altar table and chairs, which are now on display at the Heritage Centre. In his obituary in 1889, he was commended as someone who had been preeminent in the recent development of the town, and who deserved to be remembered for his contribution. As we have heard, there were at one time 3 pubs within the clubhouses complex, and one, the Black Bull, just across the road. The oldest is the Black Bull, which is a former stagecoach inn, and the place where Joseph Ridgway presided over local affairs. In 1822, the auction of the remaining building plots on the original clubhouses scheme took place there, and a second scheme was launched in 1824 under the auspices of the landlord William Pass. The 1841 census shows Thomas Elgin as publican, followed in 1851 by John Scott, who came from Cumberland. During his tenure, a number of Bolton and Nightingale Turnpike Trust meetings were held there. The names of the publicans changed regularly over the next 50 years, and in 1911 Evan Jones, a native of Cardigan, North Wales, was in charge, having recently moved from the nearby Conservative Club. Within the last 10 years, the Cub has of course been transformed into the Il Toro restaurant. The Brown Cow was the first pub to open in the clubhouses, being one of the earliest buildings to be constructed on the Church Street frontage. John Pendlebury is shown as the publican on the 1861 census. McGee Marshall took over the ownership from the Wigan Brewery Company in 1899, and their interest passed to Greenall Whitley when they were taken over in the 1970s. Within the last 2 years, the pub has been bought back by Banktop Brewery and changed its name to the Ale House, which is quite appropriate considering that was what it was when it first opened. The Sawyer's Arms stood for many years at number 4 Nelson Street. In 1861, William Lawton was the beer seller. He was also a Sawyer joiner, hence the name of the pub. The Lawtons had a long association with the club. William Lawton Jr. took over when his father died in 1878, and his wife Sarah succeeded him when he died in 1890 and was still there in the early 1900s. We also know that the pub was run in its later years by the Farnworths, the parents of our Horwich Heritage Secretary Kath Pyle, until it closed in the 1970s. It is now a private residence. The least known pub is the Horseshoe, which stood on the corner of Chapel Street and Church Street. In 1871, the publican was Alfred Sidebottom, who came from Stalybridge in Cheshire. He was also the local blacksmith. In 1903, Threlfall's Brewery offered to surrender the licences of the Horseshoe, the King Arms on Lead Lane, and the Mason's Arms in Bottomouth Moor, in order to obtain a licence for the newly built Victoria Hotel on Chorleynew Road. This was accepted, and the Horseshoe closed later that year. It then became a private dwelling, and in 1911 the occupier was Benjamin Livesey, wheelwright and funeral director, forefather of the Liveseys we know today. So, there we have it. A brief history of the area that represents the very beginnings of the Horwich we know today. First started 215 years ago, this tightly knit community of 150 stone-built breechworker cottages has survived the potential threats that have seen the loss of so many historic properties in Horwich to become a very desirable place to live. It is clear talking to the residents that they are very proud of their heritage, and they, like ourselves, are delighted to discover the details of their antecedents. What stories those little houses with their weaving cellars, back-to-backs, arches and backyards have to tell us about life in the Georgian and Victorian age, of hardship and heartache, of the will to thrive and prosper. These are the building blocks of present-day Horwich, and we look forward to learning more about them. Why don't you join us on that journey?